My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old. I work as a physical therapist in San Antonio, Texas, and 3 weeks ago, I found out my parents had sold my late husband's watch for $10 at a garage sale, without asking me, without even remembering it was his. 18 months after Jake died, that watch was the one thing I had left that still smelled faintly like him if you held it close enough. What I didn't know standing in my parents' driveway staring at an empty folding table is that the man who bought it for $10 had actually served beside my husband overseas, and he was already tracing his way back to me before I even understood what had been lost. Before I get into it, if you've ever had someone treat your grief like clutter that needed clearing, this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight because I genuinely read every single one. I need to tell you about Jake first because nothing in this story means anything without him. Jake Carter and I met when we were both 24 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Austin, standing at the same cooler reaching for the same last root beer, and we spent the rest of that evening talking until the yard emptied out around us. He was a staff sergeant in the Army, steady funny in a quiet way that snuck up on you, the kind of person who remembered small details about people he'd met only once. A coworker's daughter's name, a barista's coffee order the exact way I liked my eggs. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in his parents' backyard, and I remember thinking the entire day that I had somehow found the one person who would always come back to me no matter what. 18 months ago, during his third deployment, his unit's vehicle struck an improvised explosive device during a routine patrol outside a small forward base. He didn't survive it. I got the knock on my door on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry, and I have not been the same person since, not in any way that would surprise anyone who's lived through something like that. My best friend Rachel moved in with me for the first 6 weeks afterward because I genuinely could not be trusted alone with basic things like remembering to eat or turning off the stove. Jake's parents, Bill and Marion, drove down from Oklahoma the same week and stayed nearly a month, and I remember Marion sitting with me for hours. Some nights, neither of us saying much of anything, just existing in the same quiet grief together. I want to tell you this not for sympathy, but because I need you to understand exactly how fragile that first year was, and exactly how much every remaining piece of Jake mattered to me during it. The watch matters because it was the one object I associated most closely with him, more than his uniform, more than his dog tags, which I still wear most days under my shirt. It was a simple field watch. Nothing expensive, but I'd had it engraved on the inside of the case back before his final deployment, a small inscription only he and I knew about. "Come home to me, E." He wore it every single day he was stateside, and it was one of the few personal items returned to me afterward, since he'd left it behind for repair the week before he shipped out an accident of timing that meant it survived when so much else didn't. I couldn't look at it for the first year. I kept it along with a handful of other things in a small blue storage bin in my parents' garage because I was living in a temporary apartment after selling the house Jake and I had bought together, unable to face sorting through everything myself. My mother Diane and my father Robert had offered to store a few boxes for me during that transition, and I'd been genuinely grateful for it at the time, one less thing to manage while I was barely managing anything at all. I remember labeling that bin myself in thick black marker Emily's Jake's Things Do Not Sell and handing it to my father with careful instructions. He'd nodded, distracted already by whatever else was on his mind that day, and I let it go because I trusted him. 3 weeks ago, my mother called to mention almost as an afterthought, at the end of an unrelated conversation about a recipe she wanted to share, that they'd finally done their annual garage cleanout that past weekend, a garage sale they hold most springs to clear out accumulated clutter. I felt a small flicker of unease and asked her carefully whether any of my storage bins had gotten mixed into it by mistake. There was a pause just a beat too long. "Oh, honey, I don't think so. Though I did notice one of your bins had gotten a little disorganized in there. Some of it might have ended up on the tables. I honestly wasn't paying that close attention to what was yours versus what was ours." I want you to notice the specific way my stomach dropped hearing that sentence, because I noticed it too, standing in my own kitchen holding the phone. I drove over that same afternoon, my hands already unsteady on the wheel, And the blue bin, the one I had specifically clearly labeled, was sitting in the garage lid askew, roughly 2/3 empty. The watch was gone. If you're already feeling something tighten in your chest, stay with me, because it gets much more complicated before it gets resolved. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one. I asked my mother as calmly as I could manage, given how badly my hands were shaking, what had happened to the contents of that bin. She looked genuinely confused for a moment, then something shifted into a kind of defensive discomfort. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I must have grabbed the wrong bin when I was setting up the tables. There was so much going on that morning. Your father and I had 5 tables to fill, and Aunt Sherry kept calling about coming by early." She paused. "There was a watch in there, wasn't there? I think I remember it. A man bought it early right when we opened. I want to say we got maybe $10 for it." $10. 18 months of grief, a hand-picked engraving, the last thing that still carried Jake's presence in any physical form, sold for $10 to a stranger before 9 in the morning, because my mother hadn't been paying close enough attention to which table she was filling. I want to pause the story here and ask you something, because I've thought about it constantly since. If you found out something irreplaceable had been sold for the price of a fast food meal simply because someone hadn't bothered to check, what would you have said in that exact moment? Tell me in the comments, because I still don't think I said everything I actually felt standing in that driveway. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not yet. Not in front of her. I asked her if she remembered anything about the man who'd bought it, and she said only that he'd been polite, middle-aged, mentioned something about being new to the neighborhood, paid in cash, and left before the crowd picked up. No name, no number. Just gone along with the last physical piece of my husband I had left to hold. I called Rachel from my car in my parents' driveway, still too shaken to drive home safely, and told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I needed to hear from someone outside my own family. "Emily, this isn't just a misplaced item. Your mom needs to actually understand what she did, not just apologize for the mix-up part. There's a difference between losing something by accident and never checking carefully enough because it wasn't important to her the way it was to you." That conversation steadied me enough to actually think clearly, instead of just feeling the loss as one enormous wave. I drove home that afternoon and did the only thing that has ever steadied me when something feels unbearable. I made a plan. I posted in 3 different neighborhood social media groups describing the watch, precisely the engraving, the worn leather band offering a genuine reward, not for the watch's value, but simply for its return. I called 2 local pawn shops in case it had already changed hands again. I felt for the first time in 18 months a very specific, very focused kind of grief one, with an actual task attached to it, instead of just an empty hole to sit inside. 4 days later, I got a message through one of those neighborhood groups from a woman who said her husband had actually bought a watch matching that description at a nearby garage sale, and that he'd been trying to track down the seller himself, for reasons she didn't fully explain in the message. She gave me a phone number and told me his name was Marcus Webb. I called that number with my hands shaking again, this time for a completely different reason. "Emily?" the voice on the other end said before I'd even fully introduced myself. "Emily Carter? Jake's wife?" I want you to sit with that moment, the way I had to sit with it standing frozen in my own kitchen. This stranger, this man who had bought my husband's watch for $10 at a garage sale, already knew my name. I served with Jake. Marcus said, his voice unsteady in a way that told me this call meant something enormous to him too. 3rd Battalion. I was there that day, Emily. I was in that vehicle with him. I sat down on my kitchen floor, phone pressed hard against my ear because my legs simply stopped holding me up. Marcus explained slowly, carefully, that he'd left the service 8 months after Jake's death, struggling in ways he was still working through, and had recently moved to San Antonio to be closer to his sister, still rebuilding a version of ordinary life for himself. That Saturday morning, wandering a neighborhood garage sale, mostly to get out of his apartment, something his therapist had actually recommended small, low-stakes outings to practice being around people. Again, he'd picked up a worn field watch off a folding table, almost absent-mindedly drawn to it for reasons he couldn't fully explain at the time. It wasn't until he got home and turned it over, examining the engraving on the inside of the case, that he understood exactly what he was holding. "Come home to me." He read aloud to me over the phone, his voice cracking slightly. I remember him talking about that inscription. He showed a few of us that watch more than once. He used to say it was the whole reason he came home from every deployment before the last one. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I've turned it over constantly since. What are the actual odds in a city of over 1 million people that the one man who bought that specific watch from a table it should never have been on was someone who had personally served beside my husband who recognized that exact inscription the moment he read it? Tell me what you think in the comments, because I still don't have language for how that feels. Marcus told me he'd spent the 4 days since trying to track down whoever had sold it, going back to the same garage sale address, knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they knew the family who lived there, determined to return it properly, rather than simply keep something that clearly belonged to someone still grieving. He'd found my mother's neighbor instead, who happened to be the woman who'd messaged me. He told me quietly that part of what drove him to search so persistently was his own guilt. Something he'd been carrying since that day, 18 months earlier. A guilt he hadn't fully spoken about to anyone outside of counseling sessions he'd only recently started attending. "I keep thinking there was something more I could have done that day," he told me. "Finding that watch felt like the first thing I could actually do something about." I met Marcus 2 days later at a coffee shop near my apartment, my hands still unsteady as he set a small velvet pouch on the table between us. Inside was the watch, cleaned, the leather band carefully conditioned, clearly something he'd taken real care with over those 4 days. I opened the case back to check the mechanism, he said, because it had stopped running, and I wanted to see if it just needed a battery before I gave it back to you properly working. That's when I found this. He turned the watch over and showed me a small, tightly folded piece of paper thin as tissue that had been tucked behind the watch's back panel, clearly placed there, deliberately clearly meant to stay hidden unless someone opened that specific compartment. I unfolded it with hands that would not stop shaking. It was Jake's handwriting, dated the week before his final deployment, the same week he'd left the watch behind for repair. "If you ever read this, it means something happened to me and this watch made its way back to you somehow. I wanted to leave something in here, just in case, something just for you, not for anyone else to read first. I need you to know that no matter what happens out there, coming home to you was never just a saying. It was the only plan I ever really had. Take care of yourself, E. Let people help you even when it's hard. I love you more than this watch could ever hold." I want to be honest with you that I don't fully remember the next several minutes of sitting in that coffee shop. Marcus told me later he simply sat quietly with me, not trying to fill the silence, understanding in a way almost nobody else in my life fully had exactly what that note meant. He told me gently once I'd steadied enough to talk again that he'd sat with the letter himself for a long while before bringing it to me, debating whether to read it at all, ultimately deciding it wasn't his to keep private from me even for a moment longer than necessary. Marcus stayed with me at that coffee shop for almost 2 hours that afternoon, well past the point where the watch and the note had already been fully discussed. He told me things about Jake's final months. I had never known small, ordinary moments that made him feel closer to me than any official report ever had. He told me Jake used to talk about our future dog, an idea we'd only half seriously discussed before he deployed, describing to the rest of his unit exactly what kind of mutt he wanted to adopt once he got home, down to imagined names he'd apparently workshopped with more seriousness than I'd ever given him credit for. He told me Jake had kept a photo of me tucked into his helmet lining, worn soft at the corners from handling. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of details that don't make it into any condolence letter, but that mattered more to me in that coffee shop than almost anything anyone had said to me in the entire 18 months before it. I called Jake's parents that same evening, still raw from the afternoon, and told them everything. Marion was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she asked if she could meet Marcus herself sometime, if that wouldn't be too much to ask. I arranged it 2 weeks later, driving up to Oklahoma with the watch in my bag, and I watched Bill shake Marcus's hand for a long moment, unable to speak at first, before finally saying simply, "Thank you for bringing our son back to us again, even just a little." Marion asked Marcus dozens of gentle questions that evening about the unit, about ordinary days, hungry in the way only a mother who lost a child, that young, can be hungry for any detail that made him feel real and present again, rather than simply gone. Marcus answered every single one, patient, unhurried, understanding exactly what that hunger felt like from the other side of it. Here's the part of this story I need to tell you now, because it's the part that still sits uncomfortably with me. My parents had been storing that watch along with the note neither of us knew was hidden inside it for 18 months, and it had taken a stranger's careful attention, someone who had no obligation to me at all, to notice what my own mother had rushed past without a second look. I called my mother that evening and told her everything: the phone call from Marcus, the note, all of it. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that told me exactly how she'd been processing the entire situation. "Well, I'm glad it worked out. Isn't that a nice story that it found its way back to you like that?" I want you to notice what's missing from that sentence, because I noticed it immediately. Not an apology for the carelessness that had put it on that table in the first place. Just relief that the story had a tidy ending, one that let her off the hook for the actual mistake. "Mom," I said, "it didn't just work out. A man who served with Jake happened to be walking past your garage sale that morning. If he hadn't been, that watch and the note inside it would be gone forever, and I would never have known either of those things existed." She was quiet again. "I really am sorry, Emily. I didn't think a watch was something you'd be that attached to. I thought grief was more about the big things." I told her as gently as I could manage, while still meaning every word. Grief lives in the small things too. Mom, that's exactly where it lives. My father called me a few days later, quieter than my mother had been, and told me he'd actually remembered helping set up that table himself, and that he'd seen the watch briefly, thought it looked like something worth keeping, and had meant to ask my mother about it before the sale started, but had gotten pulled into moving furniture and simply forgot. "I should have trusted that instinct," he said. "I had a feeling about it, and I let the morning get away from me instead of listening to it." It wasn't a full explanation for what had happened, but it was at least an honest one, and it mattered more to me than I expected it to. Here's where things stand now. My parents have started asking me directly now, before touching anything of mine stored at their house, a small overdue change that came at a real cost to learn. Marcus and I have stayed in touch since that coffee shop meeting, an unexpected friendship neither of us anticipated, built entirely out of a $10 mistake, and the specific kind of understanding that only comes from two people who loved in very different ways, the same person. Rachel has met Marcus twice now and told me, only half joking, that it feels like Jake found a way to send someone to check on me even now. Marion and Bill still text Marcus directly, sometimes small check-ins, an unexpected new branch of family grown entirely out of grief, and a folding table that should never have held that watch in the first place. I wear the watch again, now repaired, running properly, the note folded carefully and kept in a small frame beside our wedding photo, instead of hidden inside a case back where it could have stayed lost forever. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. The things people leave behind aren't just objects, even when they look like ordinary ones from the outside. Sometimes the person holding something you've stopped noticing is the only one who actually understands what it's worth. Pay closer attention to what you're clearing out and to who might still need it more than you realize. If this story reminded you of something precious that almost slipped away, share this with someone who'd understand. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Marcus finding that watch was simply chance or something closer to fate? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.